Hello there, Díomh Accordia. Thank you for tuning in. I'd like to speak to you in this short presentation about the remarkable story of Annie J. Cronin of Cumann, somebody who I discovered and whose story I discovered during research recently, which I've completed for a book I'm publishing shortly on the Ballymacandy Ambush, which happened between Milltown and Castlemaine in June of 1921. And Annie Cronin's story is one of the many stories of the participants in the revolutionary period, which are now coming to light thanks to the availability of records which have been published and made more publicly accessible in recent years. And I think that hers is one of the more remarkable stories of the members of Cumann in this period, the women's organisation, which played such an integral role in the revolutionary period. And I will speak about Annie briefly, about her involvement in the period and about the pension and allowances which she applied for in later life in respect of her involvement in the period, which provides us with a lot of the information about what Annie Cronin and her comrades got up to a century ago. Annie was a member of Cumann, and I won't dwell too much on Cumann or its origins or objectives, but it was, as many people will know, a women's organisation which was established in 1914 to further the cause of Irish independence. It was founded in Wynn's Hotel in Dublin in April 1914, and it set out a number of significant aims and objectives, and over subsequent years it played a very significant role in the revolutionary period, in the War of Independence and in the Civil War. Among those who were present incidentally at the founding meeting of Cumann in Dublin was Anne O'Rahilly, who was a sister of the O'Rahilly from Ballylongford in North Kerry, and who was killed in the dying hours and days of the Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916. And one description I found of Cumann recently was that it had an intense desire for national self-determination. And certainly its role is coming to be more appreciated and understood in recent years, thanks to more of a focus on the role of women in this period and the availability of a large number of resources from libraries and archives, some of which I'll speak about in a moment. In Kerry, branches of Cumann were formed in the years after 1914. This is just one image that I'd like to share of members of Kilordan Cumann in their uniforms, and this is from the Kilordan archives. There were branches also in Mid-Kerry, in my own home village and parish of Milltown. There was quite a large company in Keele, west of Castlemaine, and for example also in Kilgobnet in Beaufort. They would have been the principal branches of Cumann in Mid-Kerry, the area that I'm most concerned with in this presentation, and certainly their involvement in the period is becoming more appreciated as we mark the centenary of these events. So to speak about the subject of this presentation, Annie Cronin, Annie Sis Cronin, who was from my own parish of Milltown in County Kerry, and who was from Brackhill in Castlemaine. This is a picture of Annie in later life. But we'll speak briefly about her upbringing and how she came to be involved in Cumann, and ultimately about what she and her comrades got up to during the revolutionary period. Annie Cronin was born, as I say, in 1901 in Brackhill, near Castlemaine. This is the census return from 1911, which includes, second from the bottom, Annie Cronin, who was the daughter of John and Anne Cronin. They lived on a farm on the banks of the River Main near Castlemaine. So here in 1911 we can see that Annie was just 9 years of age, and she's listed as a scholar and single, obviously, because of her youth. Brackhill, incidentally, was quite a significant area in terms of IRA activity and Cumann activity in this period. Quite a number of members of both the IRA and Cumann were from the townland of Brackhill, which, as you can see here on the map, is quite near Castlemaine and runs, if you like, east from Milltown and Castlemaine towards Fireys. Further to the east, it's a townland that bounds the road, the main road from Milltown through by Castlemaine and on towards Fireys. And it was home to quite a number of, for a small rural townland, it was home to quite a number of the more significant figures of the IRA and Cumann in mid-Kerry. And this wouldn't be uncommon in this period, in that quite a large number of neighbours and relatives and members of the same family would have been members of or would have got involved in the various organisations at the time. Among Annie Cronin's neighbours from Brackhill were some important figures in mid-Kerry in this period. Among them would be Daniel Mulvihill from Brackhill, who was very active in the IRA, in the Irish Volunteers originally, and in the IRA during the War of Independence, and subsequently also very involved in the Civil War. Another of her, and indeed Dan Mulvihill's sisters, were also members of Cumann, like their neighbour Annie Cronin. Another neighbour would have been Jack Flynn, who lived at Brackhill Cross and who was later a Fianna Fáil TD for South Kerry and a successful member of the Dáil for many, many years. Like the others have mentioned, his brothers and family members were also very active in the Republican movement. And other neighbours of Annie Cronin's would have included Sonny Mason, who was officer commanding of the Kiltala Company of the IRA, and he lived at Brackhill for many years with his wife Amelia Wade, who's from Kilordan, who was a member of a very active Republican family in Kilordan as well. Her brother and her sister and a number of other family members and relatives were quite active and involved in this period. Annie Cronin had a number of brothers who were in the IRA, 4 brothers indeed. One of them was Jimmy Cronin, and this is a picture of Jimmy in later life. As I said, it wasn't uncommon that a number of members of the same family would be active in the IRA or Cumann at the time, and quite active, frequently members of Cumann you'll find were the sisters or partners or wives or daughters indeed of men who were in the IRA. And we're lucky to have a first-hand account of Jimmy Cronin's involvement in this period through his witness statement, which is held in the Bureau of Military History and which is available online. And it's witness statement 1000, in fact, and that sets out in a lot of detail Jimmy Cronin's involvement in the IRA in this period. Annie Cronin was a member of the Milltown Company of Cumann, the A Company, and in the military archives, some of the detail of which I'm sharing here, we get details of the members and who was involved in Cumann at that time. So, for example, we can see here that it was the A Company Milltown. The officer commanding was May Allman. The first lieutenant was Nellie Corkerton, and the second lieutenant was Cathy Healy. The branches and the companies of Cumann were modelled on the same on the IRA companies, I suppose, in that they had an officer commanding and various ranks in the company. And May Allman, incidentally, the officer commanding of the Milltown Company, was a sister of Daniel Allman, who of course was killed in the Headford Junction ambush in March of 1921. The military archives contains a list of the members of the Milltown Company and those who Annie Cronin would have served alongside. It was part of the 6th Battalion of the Kerry No. 2 Brigade, and on the left here is the actual handwritten list of names that are contained in the military archives, and I've transcribed the names here on the right. So it was quite a large and quite an active company, and this list is from July 1921, just at the end of the War of Independence and as the truce began. So the source for a lot of the information that I have about Annie Cronin is thankfully the military archives, and I say thankfully because in recent years a huge amount of work has begun and been carried out in digitising records from this period, and which are available on the military archives website. For example, there are pension applications from participants in the revolutionary period. There are witness statements, one of which I mentioned a moment ago, files relating to applications for medals, activity reports in relation to details of the incidents and events that companies of the IRA and Cumann were involved in, and organisation files, which include, for example, the list of the Milltown Cumann, which I shared a moment ago. Very accessible, well worth a visit, and easy to search. If you do have anybody or relatives or anybody you are interested in learning more about, it's very easy to find that information, and a lot of work is continuing in that regard to make more of that information and detail available. So among the applications for a military pension in subsequent years, which I'll return to later, is that of Annie Cronin, and this is actually the cover of the folder in which her paperwork is contained in the military archives. And what we get on the website also is details, a sort of a summary of the applicant, her address, date of birth, date of death, and so on, and a lot more information besides. So that is the source of a lot of the detail that I have in relation to Annie Cronin, and which has only come into the public domain in recent years. We are able to obtain from Annie Cronin's accounts the type of activities that she engaged in and the types of activities that the members of Cumann in this period engaged in. And here is an extract from the sworn evidence which Annie Cronin would have given to the interviewing officer. Applicants for a military pension had to undergo quite an, I suppose, an intensive application process, part of which involved having to be interviewed about what exactly you were involved in, who you were involved with, and you had to give quite a lot of detail about your involvement in order to qualify for a pension. So we know from the accounts contained, and this is just one extract, that Annie joined the Milltown Cumann when she was just 17 years old in 1918, and she seems to have quickly risen through the ranks because she became a branch treasurer soon after, and she'd have been responsible for handling the funds of the local company. And among the many activities that she details in her account was, I suppose, or were, I suppose, providing support to the IRA and to her brothers in the IRA and those involved in the local battalion. So, for example, we know that she was involved in making haversacks for IRA members, in carrying messages, carrying messages between companies of the IRA, and quite often because women were less suspected by the police of being involved, or might not have been known for their involvement. It was far safer for them sometimes, not always of course, but sometimes, to carry messages for the IRA. Annie also specified that she was involved in fundraising, particularly in organising dances and concerts to raise funds for the IRA. And I've come across accounts from the locality of events like that being held in the years before and during the War of Independence. She also hid and carried weapons, and that meant carrying guns and ammunition, and hiding guns and ammunition. And I suppose maybe there may have been a perception for many years of Cumann being if you like, a sort of a supine organisation in the background. But the evidence from recent years suggests that quite often the women who were involved often put their lives on the line and put themselves at huge personal safety, or put their personal safety at risk and put their lives at risk by being involved in things like carrying weapons and hiding weapons in their homes and in their sheds and in their outhouses and so on. Because obviously if they were discovered, there was a great risk that that individual member of Cumann would face the full rigours of the authorities. And as we will see, that happened in a couple of incidents with Annie Cronin. Apart from that, Annie's account sets out how she was involved in training camps, hosting meetings, catering for the IRA, keeping men in the house who were on the run from the authorities. She was also involved in first aid if there were IRA men who were injured or needed first aid as a result of an incident, and washing and repairing clothes for IRA men as well was quite common, as many of them were on the run and not able to stay in their own homes. Annie specifies that she and her comrades attended first aid classes in Milltown twice a week, and they were provided by the local doctor from Milltown, Dr. Dan Sheehan, who was, apart from being the medical doctor in the locality and the local coroner, he was also the medical officer of the Kerry No. 1 Brigade, and as such would have been regularly called to provide first aid and to provide medical attention to IRA members and Cumann members, for that matter, who were injured or wounded in the various incidents of the period. He was based at Main Street in Milltown and later at Glenellen, and he's an important figure in the research that I've done on the Ballymacandy Ambush. And he was the son of a member of Parliament for East Kerry for many years, Jeremiah Sheehan. But he did, according to Annie's account and other accounts, hold classes for Cumann members to teach them the basics of first aid should they need those skills. We have here a handwritten account from Annie Cronin's pension file. Quite often the applicants would write at length about the incidents they were involved in and what they were involved in this period. And one of the, I suppose, maybe lighter episodes from this period was detailed later by Dan Mulvihill, who I mentioned a moment ago, a neighbour of Annie Cronin's. At one point at the beginning of 1921, Liam Lynch, who was the commander of the 1st Southern Division of the IRA, I suppose the most powerful IRA figure in the south of Ireland during the War of Independence. He actually stayed at the home of Dan Mulvihill in Brackhill and Castlemaine, and they held a meeting of local senior IRA leaders there. And Annie Cronin in her account says that she catered for and looked after Liam Lynch and other senior IRA leaders. So one can only imagine at this remove what it must have been like for young women in the area and the young men indeed to play host to one of the most senior Republican leaders of the time. And Dan Mulvihill in his account, and this I suppose describes in a humorous way the efforts they would have made to disguise Liam Lynch and his colleagues as they were travelling through Kerry. And in his account, Dan Mulvihill says that Liam Lynch was the most wanted man in Ireland, and the meeting that they held in Brackhill was the best guarded meeting ever held in Kerry. There were scouts within sight of each other all the way to Tralee, Killarney, Killorglin and Farranfore. And Humphrey Murphy, who was a local IRA leader, was no bother, as my clothes could fit him. We were the one height, 6'2", but Liam Lynch got the pants and coat of a brother of mine, and I can still see him holding the pants under his armpits. So certainly there wasn't much glamour as Liam Lynch went about the highways and byways of Kerry in the spring of 1921 and enjoyed, I'm sure, Annie Cronin's hospitality and those of her comrades. Annie Cronin was present in the immediate aftermath of the Ballymacandy ambush, which I mentioned, which took place between Milltown and Castlemaine on the 1st of June 1921, and in which 4 RIC officers and 1 member of the Black and Tans were killed in an ambush involving a number of companies of the IRA from mid-Kerry. And the only casualty, IRA casualty on that day who was injured was Jerry Miles, who's pictured here. Jerry Miles from Tralee, who sustained quite a serious bullet wound. He did survive, but he was the only injured IRA man on the day. And in her account, Annie Cronin says that she went to Ballymacandy and attended to the wounded after the ambush, helped to remove the Tans who were dying. So she obviously tended to the injured police constables, as well as tending to Jerry Miles. She says that she was raided after the Ballymacandy ambush, and the ammunition that she had in her house was removed before they arrived. So it would have been quite common after an ambush, particularly where members of the RIC or the Black and Tans were killed, that there would be a raid of the homes of known Republicans or known IRA or Cumann members. But Annie obviously knew what was coming and decided to have the ammunition that was in her house removed elsewhere so that it wouldn't be found. If anything, the involvement of Annie Cronin in this period intensified during the Civil War. And again, we have from her own account what exactly she was involved in this period. And she was arrested and jailed on 2 occasions during the Civil War. And she details here how she was arrested with Molly Miles, a member of Cumann from Tralee. On 1 occasion during the Civil War, she was taken to Castlemaine by the Free State troops, where she says she was kept for 9 or 10 days. And later in another raid, Miss Miles and herself were arrested and taken to Tralee and held for a fortnight or 3 weeks. And even after that, on her release, she continued to be involved in training. She was involved, for example, in organising and catering for a training camp that was held at Kilburn House near Milltown, and continued to carry messages and carry ammunition at that point for the anti-treaty IRA, which her brothers were members of. So in terms of the pension application that I mentioned earlier on, and from which the information for this presentation is, from which it's derived, there was quite a complicated process which I won't go into for pension applicants, but suffice to say that those who could prove and set out what their role had been during this period were entitled to various allowances and payments, I suppose by way of recompense to some extent and compensation for what they had endured and the role they had played in bringing about the independence of Ireland. So we have a lot of paperwork to sift through, which I won't go through now here, but which we have on Annie Cronin's file and the other files, which give us a lot of the rich detail that allows us to tell stories like hers. Part of the application process would have required Annie to set out during the various periods what she was involved in and to provide referees who would be able to testify to her involvement in various incidents. So she would have identified Mary Corkerton, Kathleen Barrett, May Allman here, fellow members of Cumann, who would provide testimony in support of her allowance or pension application. And she also would have included Dan Mulvihill, John Flynn, that's Jack Flynn that I mentioned a moment ago, and Thomas O'Connor, pictured here, who was a native of Knockreach in Milltown and who was the officer commanding at the Ballymacandy Ambush in June 1921. And on the files, we will find a lot of correspondence from people like that in support of the applications of people like Annie Cronin. This is another example from Tom McAllister, probably one of the more high-profile and better-known figures from this period. And he would have written a letter to the Department of Defence in January 1943 in support of Annie Cronin's application for a special allowance for her role with Cumann. And he said here, quote, "I have personal knowledge also that she gave valuable assistance to the IRA Active Service Unit operating in her district." So this would be typical of the type of letters that people like Tom McAllister and the senior IRA leaders would have written at the time in support of the applications of participants in this period. In summary, without going into too much detail, Annie Cronin was awarded a special allowance in 1943, but she appealed that decision because the Department of Defence ruled that her Civil War service, for some reason, wasn't eligible for inclusion, and she did succeed with that appeal because the allowance was increased to 3-year service. She was awarded a military pension then of £77 per year in 1965, when she would have, which was the retirement age. But what occurred in many of these cases, and in this case also, is that some of the pensions and allowance payments were reduced as people got older. And what occurred in this particular case was that when the Cronin family, Annie Cronin and her brother John, sold their farm in 1973, the special allowance that she had been receiving since 1943 was terminated by the department, who ruled that because she and her brother had sold the farm, that they had, I suppose, an increased income from that, and that she was no longer eligible. And she wrote to politicians and a number of people who were senior in the department, including to the Minister for Defence, Paddy Donegan, at the time, appealing that decision and the reduction in the allowance. And for example, here on the right, we can see that she had to submit details of the various payments that her brother John had received from Castlemaine Creamery, the local creamery, for the milk he would have supplied over a number of years. And quite often applicants for these pensions and allowances were put through very lengthy and quite onerous, if you like, correspondence to prove their involvement in the first instance in the period, but also to ensure that they didn't suffer financially as the years went on. As I said a moment ago, Annie Cronin's pension was reduced in the early 1970s, and this is a handwritten letter that she sent to Timothy Chubb O'Connor, the Fianna Fáil TD, who was a neighbour of hers from Kilordan and who was himself involved in the War of Independence. And she explains in her letter to Chubb that she was extremely disappointed to learn that her pension had been reduced. And among what she says here is, "I got a bit of a shock. If that's the treatment I deserve in my old age, I was never so upset this morning." And she notes, "We never gave this government a bad turn. We always looked after them." And she's referring there to the Fianna Fáil government at the time, of which Chubb was a backbencher. And I suppose, like many anti-treaty members of Cumann and the IRA, Annie and her brothers would have been supporters of Fianna Fáil, and Jimmy Cronin, indeed her brother, was quite active in Fianna Fáil for many years. So quite a lot of the applicants at this time felt, I suppose, let down or betrayed by the party that they supported, if their payments were reduced or if their payments were impacted in any way. And that, of course, applied obviously to Fine Gael governments over the years. But in this case, Annie felt compelled to write to Chubb O'Connor in her older years, wondering why, at that age of her life, her pension and her payment for her involvement in the revolutionary period was being reduced. And curiously, and this was the title of my presentation, despite all of the difficulties she had with the department in securing the special allowance in the first place and appealing it in the 40s, and then despite a reduction in her pension in the years later, Annie Cronin on one occasion received two pension checks or two allowance checks, I should say, in the post by mistake. And clearly she was a very honest individual and decided to write back to the department in December 1967 saying, "Achara, I received two checks this morning. I'm returning one, as honesty is the best of policy. It was a mistake, as any person is liable to forget these times. Wishing you all in the department a very happy and prosperous new year, from Annie J. Cronin." So I was just struck by the fact that despite the difficulties that she did have with the department in qualifying in the first place or proving eligibility for an allowance, that even when she did receive 2 cheques by mistake, instead of maybe running off to the bank or the post office to cash the 2 of them in, she decided to return one of the cheques to the department. And speaking of cheques, one of the features of the pension archives is that they do actually contain and hold copies, in most cases, of the payments made to applicants. And this was sent to, was the final payment made to Annie Cronin. She was unmarried and she spent a couple of years in St. Joseph's Nursing Home in Killorglin before finishing up in Carragoran House, a nursing home in Newmarket-on-Fergus, County Clare. And this cheque for £68.93 was sent on the 31st of July 1984. But Annie Cronin had passed away just the day before, on the 30th of July, and this cheque, which is on her file, was obviously therefore returned to the department. And the solicitor in Newmarket-on-Fergus who acted on her behalf would have corresponded with the department to advise that she had passed on. So that is quite a brief whistle-stop tour, really, through the role in which Annie Cronin from Brackhill, Castlemaine played in this seminal and important period in our history. It's one of many accounts that are held in the military archives, and that for many years weren't really spoken about, because in my years researching this topic, quite often what is said by relatives and descendants of the men and women involved was that they didn't talk about it. And whether Annie Cronin spoke to her brothers and friends and neighbours about what she was involved in those days, I do not know, but certainly we can read now for the first time, because of the publication of her archive and her account, the role that she played in this important period. And I think it's critically important that we come more to appreciate the role of Cumann and what the women of our towns and villages and parishes got up to 100 years ago, and how that contributed to the course of our history. The book that I will be publishing shortly, hopefully in late April or early May of this year, is called Ballymacandy, the story of a Kerry ambush. And Annie Cronin is but one of the many people who features in that book. It details of the publication of the book, and when it's coming, will be available on my website, which is owenoshay.ie. And if you'd like to get in touch about anything I've said here, or any information about this period, I'd certainly love to hear from you. My email address is there. So I hope you found the story of Annie Cronin of interest, and I'm conscious that I'm actually recording it and publishing it as International Women's Day occurs, the 8th of March 2021. So I'd like to think that's my own little tribute or little contribution to International Women's Day, by telling the story of Annie Cronin, who was involved in such a turbulent and tumultuous time in our history a century ago. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Gora Mila Mahagov.